The assignments seemed reasonable on the surface. Handling unstable explosives that required steady hands and clear thinking. Working alone in unstable tunnel sections where cave-ins were common, or maintaining equipment near the treacherous cliff edges where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall. But the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who paid attention. The men selected for these dangerous duties were invariably those who would be least missed by their fellow workers and whose deaths would cause the minimum disruption to camp morale. What made the system so insidiously effective was its veneer of practical necessity and professional competence. When 23-year-old German immigrant Friedrich Kohler was found dead at the bottom of a ravine on January 2nd, allegedly having fallen while checking survey markers in an area known for unstable footing. His death was treated as another tragic accident in an inherently dangerous profession. Kohler had been isolated within the camp due to language barriers and cultural differences, making him an ideal candidate for elimination, according to Brenner's utilitarian calculus. Brenner's immediate response to each death had become so routine that none of the workers even questioned it anymore. Accepting his presence at accident scenes as natural as a doctor responding to medical emergencies, the cook would arrive with his specialized tools and begin his grisly work with an efficiency that suggested extensive experience processing each victim with techniques that had been refined through practice and experimentation. The psychological transformation of the camp was perhaps more disturbing than the physical acts of cannibalism, representing a complete breakdown of the social bonds that had held the crew together during the early months of construction. Men who had once shared stories of their families back home, trading photographs and letters, Rom loved ones during evening gatherings, now spoke only of work schedules and equipment maintenance with the mechanical precision of factory workers rather than human beings. The evening gatherings around the cook fires, once filled with songs and jokes that helped maintain morale during difficult times, had become silent affairs, where workers consumed their enhanced rations with the mechanical efficiency of animals. Feeding at a trough, trust had been replaced by a constant state of weariness, with each man calculating his own value to the group and assessing potential threats from his companions, while trying to avoid behaviors that might mark him for elimination. Thomas Cannibalism had embraced his role as chief enforcer with an enthusiasm that surprised even Samuel Hartwell, who had initially viewed the Dublin Giant as a useful subordinate rather than a true partner in their enterprise. Cannibalism seemed to take genuine pleasure in the selection process, approaching potential victims with the same methodical patience he had once applied to railroad construction tasks, studying their habits and weaknesses with the focused attention of a predator, choosing prey. When young Irish immigrant Daniel McCarthy began showing signs of exhaustion and malnutrition in mid-January, displaying the hollow-eyed look and trembling hands that marked him as a liability to the crew's productivity. Cannibalism appointed himself McCarthy's constant companion and helper. The assistant foreman offered assistance with heavy lifting and provided seemingly genuine friendship during a time when social isolation could be fatal, creating a false sense of security that made the eventual betrayal more effective. 3 days later, McCarthy was found crushed beneath a load of timber that had allegedly shifted during transport from the cutting area to the construction site, with Cannibalism conveniently present to witness the accident and help extract the body from beneath the heavy logs. The timing was perfect, occurring just as the camp's enhanced food supplies were running low and the men were beginning to show signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Edwin Cartwright, had initially attempted to document what he suspected were deliberate killings, maintaining detailed notes about the circumstances surrounding each death and the inconsistencies in the official explanations. His medical training had taught him to observe evidence objectively and draw logical conclusions from physical facts, making him potentially dangerous to the system that Hartwell and his associates had established. But by late January, even Cartwright had succumbed to the prevailing madness that had infected every aspect of camp life. His medical oath overwhelmed by the brutal pragmatism of survival and the psychological pressure of prolonged isolation when he examined the body of railroad worker Joseph Bellacourt on January 24th, another alleged accident victim whose injuries were inconsistent with the described circumstances. Cartwright simply noted death by misadventure in his log and helped Brenner transport the corpse to the cook tent without conducting the thorough investigation that his training demanded. The most chilling aspect of Camp 17's transformation was how completely normal the systematic murder and cannibalism had begun to feel to the surviving workers who had adapted to their new reality with a psychological flexibility that would have been impossible to imagine under normal circumstances. Men who had once been horrified by the prospect of consuming human flesh now eagerly anticipated mealtimes, gathering around the cook fires with genuine enthusiasm while praising Brenner's culinary innovations and even making specific requests for particular preparations. The cook had developed an extensive repertoire of techniques for disguising the taste and texture of human meat, incorporating wild seasonings and creative combinations that made their grim rations not just palatable, but genuinely appetizing to men whose moral compass had been completely destroyed by hunger and desperation. Brenner's creativity in the kitchen had become a source of pride within the camp, with workers competing to offer compliments and suggestions for future meals, as if they were guests at a fine restaurant rather than participants in systematic cannibalism. The first crack in the carefully constructed facade of Camp 17's cannibalistic society appeared in early February, when Polish immigrant Kazimierz Kowalski made a discovery that would ultimately provide the most comprehensive record of the winter's atrocities. Kowalski, a former university student who had immigrated to America following political troubles in his homeland, possessed both the education and moral clarity necessary to document what was happening around him with scientific precision while searching for usable materials in the abandoned equipment shed. Kowalski discovered a cache of personal belongings that told the true story of the camp's diminishing population. Watches, wedding rings, family photographs, and personal letters from dozens of workers who had allegedly wandered off or died in accidents were hidden beneath loose floorboards, creating a grim museum of the dead that contradicted every official explanation for their disappearances. Among the most damning evidence were detailed notes in Brenner's handwriting that cataloged each victim's physical characteristics, estimated meat yield, and preparation methods with the clinical precision of a scientific study. The cook had been conducting experiments in human butchery, refining his techniques, and keeping careful records of which approaches produce the best results in terms of both quantity and palatability. Kowalski began maintaining his own secret record of events, writing in a mixture of Polish and English to avoid detection while documenting the systematic nature of the murders and the psychological transformation of his fellow workers. In diary entries provide chilling insights into the daily life of a community that had abandoned every principle of civilized behavior in favor of carefully organized survival cannibalism. February 8th. They took Michelson today. Kowalski wrote in one entry, "The poor Swedish boy never had a chance." Once, Connecade marked him for selection. Found him this morning with his skull crushed, same as the others. Brenner was already sharpening his knives before the body was cold. We'll eat well tonight, and tomorrow the cycle begins again, with someone else marked for death. the discovery of additional evidence began to reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that had taken control of Camp 17. Hidden among Hartwell's papers, Kowalski found correspondence with railroad company officials that suggested the foreman had been reporting false information about the camp's population and condition, claiming that missing workers had deserted rather than died, thus avoiding any corporate responsibility for their fate. More disturbing still were indications that the systematic cannibalism had been planned rather than arising spontaneously from desperate circumstances. References to alternative food sources and creative resource management in early correspondence suggested that company officials were aware of what was happening and had chosen to ignore it rather than risk the expense and negative publicity of a rescue operation. By February 1868, the systematic nature of the killings had created an atmosphere of such pervasive terror that the remaining 87 workers had effectively segregated themselves into two distinct groups. The inner circle of Hartwell, Connencade Brenner, and their most trusted allies, who openly discussed their feeding schedule and victim selection criteria, and the increasingly desperate outer circle of workers who understood exactly what was happening but felt powerless to stop it or escape from their mountain prison. The inner circle had developed elaborate justifications for their actions that went far beyond simple survival, creating a pseudo-intellectual framework that transformed murder and cannibalism into acts of rational resource management. During evening meetings in Hartwell's quarters, they spoke of their work in terms of natural selection and social Darwinism, arguing that they were creating a superior workforce by eliminating the weak and inefficient members of their community. Brenner, whose education had included some exposure to scientific theories popular in European universities, provided pseudo-intellectual backing for their cannibalistic practices, with lectures on nutrition and human physiology that claimed consuming the flesh of fellow humans provided superior protein and even psychological benefits. "We're becoming something stronger than ordinary men," Brenner explained to his increasingly devoted followers during one particularly chilling gathering in early February. "Each man we process makes us more resilient, more capable of surviving conditions that would destroy workers who cling to outdated moral restrictions." The group had begun keeping detailed records of their meals that went far beyond simple documentation, noting which victims had provided the most satisfactory nutrition, which preparation methods yielded the best results, and even recording the psychology. They call effects of consuming different types of human flesh. Brenner had even begun experimenting with preservation techniques borrowed from his military experience, smoking and salting human flesh to create supplies that could last longer between kills and provide variety in their diet. The outer circle, meanwhile, lived in constant terror of being selected for the next accident, knowing that any sign of weakness or social isolation could mark them for death. Workers began sleeping in shifts with trusted companions, keeping watch through the night while others rested, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and sleeplessness that further weakened their physical and mental resistance to the horror surrounding them. Some attempted to form alliances for mutual protection, but these efforts were consistently undermined by the harsh reality that any group large enough to resist the inner circle would also be large enough to threaten the food supply that was keeping everyone alive through the mountain winter. The mathematics of survival had created an impossible situation where cooperation meant starvation and resistance meant immediate death. The breaking point came on February 14th, when Irish worker Brian Donnelly attempted to organize an armed resistance against what he called the murdering bastards who've turned us into monsters, worse than any wild animal. Donnelly had managed to convince 12 other workers to join his rebellion, appealing to their remaining humanity and their memories of the moral men they had once been before hunger and desperation had transformed them into something unrecognizable. The rebels had begun stockpiling weapons and supplies for a confrontation with Hartwell's group, planning to overthrow the cannibalistic leadership and either attempt to escape through the mountain passes or establish a more humane system of survival until rescue arrived. But their planning was discovered by Brenner's network of informants, men who had become so psychologically dependent on the cannibalistic system that they viewed any threat to it as a threat to their own survival. The confrontation was swift and brutal, occurring during the pre-dawn hours, when most of the CA-MP was asleep and unable to witness or interfere with the violence. Connecade led a group of loyalists in a coordinated attack on Donnelly's hiding place, claiming later that the rebels had attacked first and forced them to defend themselves in what appeared to be a desperate fight for survival. When the violence ended with the methodical efficiency of a military operation, Donnelly and 4 of his allies were dead, their bodies bearing injuries that clearly indicated deliberate execution rather than combat wounds. The remaining rebels were given a choice that perfectly illustrated the moral bankruptcy of their situation. Join the inner circle as full participants in the killing and cannibalism, or be processed themselves as the next meal. 7 of the 8 surviving rebels chose integration, abandoning any pretense of moral resistance in favor of guaranteed survival that required them to participate actively in selecting and killing their former companions. Only one man, Kazimierz Kowalski, refused to participate directly in the murders, though he continued to consume the human flesh that sustained the camp through his detailed documentation of events, creating a compromised position that made him invaluable as a chronicler, while keeping him barely alive. Kowalski's detailed diary, discovered decades later in the effects of his grandson, provides the most comprehensive account of Camp 17's descent into systematic cannibalism and reveals the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary men to become enthusiastic participants in ritualized murder. His entries describe a community where the normal boundaries between civilization and savagery had been completely erased, replaced by a new social order based entirely on the efficient production and consumption of human flesh. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Camp 17 intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of survival and savagery in the Utah wilderness. The Inner Circle's complete control over Camp 17 was cemented by the establishment of what they called the roster, a formal schedule of victims that extended through the remainder of the winter, organized with the same attention to detail that Hartwell had once applied to railroad construction schedules. Workers were ranked according to their usefulness, social connections, and perceived loyalty to the new order, creating a hierarchy where everyone knew their approximate position on the list of future meals. Those at the bottom of the roster knew they had perhaps days or weeks to live, while those at the top enjoyed the privilege of participating in the selection of future victims and helping to maintain the system that kept them temporarily safe. The psychological effect was devastating, as men who had once been friends and colleagues now viewed each other primarily in terms of their relative position on the death list and their potential value as food sources. The true horror of Camp 17 became apparent not just in the systematic nature of the killings, but in the elaborate infrastructure that had been created to support and conceal the cannibalistic operation. By mid-February, Brenner had transformed his cook tent into a sophisticated processing facility that rivaled professional slaughterhouses in its efficiency and organization, complete with specialized tools for different aspects of human butchery and preservation techniques that ensured maximum utilization of each victim. The cook had developed a complex system for categorizing human meat based on the victim's age, physical condition, and cause of death, with different preparation methods applied to optimize both nutritional value and palatability. Younger victims provided more tender meat that required minimal seasoning, while older workers yielded tougher flesh that benefited from slow cooking methods and careful spicing to mask nigh undesirable flavors or textures. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that Brenner had been conducting systematic experiments in human nutrition, testing theories about which organs provided the greatest energy, which preparation methods preserve the most vitamins, and even whether consuming specific body parts might confer psychological or physical benefits to the cannibals. His notes revealed a scientific approach to anthropology that transformed murder into research and elevated cannibalism to the level of a medical discipline. The camp's transformation had attracted the attention of wildlife that normally avoided human settlements, with wolves and bears drawn by the constant smell of cooking meat and the disposal of unusable body parts in remote areas of the valley. Workers reported seeing larger and more aggressive scavengers than usual, suggesting that the ecosystem itself had been altered by the camp's activities, and that evidence of their crimes might persist long after the winter ended. Emil Hartwell had meanwhile established communication protocols with railroad company officials that involved systematic deception about the camp's actual condition and population. His telegrams reported fictional progress on construction projects, claimed that missing workers had deserted for better opportunities elsewhere, and described weather conditions and supply needs that bore little resemblance to reality. The correspondence suggests a deliberate effort to prevent any rescue attempts or investigations that might expose what was happening in the mountain camp. More sinister still were indications that some company officials suspected the truth about Camp 17, but chose to ignore it rather than face the financial and legal consequences of acknowledging systematic murder and cannibalism among their workforce. References to alternative resource management and creative problem-solving under adverse conditions in corporate correspondence suggest that executives were willing to overlook atrocities as long as they didn't become public knowledge or interfere with the railroad's expansion schedule. The psychological control exerted by the inner circle extended beyond simple fear of death to include sophisticated manipulation of group dynamics and individual psychology. Hartwell had implemented a system of rewards and privileges that encouraged workers to compete for favor with their cannibalistic leaders, creating incentives for betrayal and collaboration that ensured the survival of their system even among workers who might otherwise resist. Workers who demonstrated enthusiasm for the new order were given better sleeping quarters, larger food portions, and protection from selection for future meals, while those who showed reluctance or moral qualms found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The system created powerful psychological pressure to not just tolerate cannibalism, but to embrace it as a necessary and even beneficial adaptation to their circumstances. The final collapse of any pretense of civilization at Camp 17 began on March 3, 1868, when the long-awaited supply train finally appeared on the horizon, struggling through the mountain passes with provisions that could have saved dozens of lives if delivered months earlier. The sight of the approaching locomotive should have been cause for celebration among the survivors. But instead, it created a crisis within the camp's leadership that would ultimately reveal the full extent of their moral disintegration and the impossibility of concealing their winter activities from outside observers. Samuel Hartwell called an emergency meeting of the inner circle to address what he termed the supply problem, recognizing that the arrival of railroad officials and fresh supplies would make their carefully constructed deception impossible to maintain. With outside observers about to arrive, the evidence of their winter activities would be immediately apparent to anyone with basic observational skills and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about the camp's dramatically reduced population. The cook tent was filled with preserved human flesh, organized with the efficiency of a commercial meat processing facility. The camp's population had been reduced from 127 to fewer than 40 survivors through systematic murder, and many of the remaining workers bore the psychological scars of months spent in a cannibalistic hell that had transformed them into something barely recognizable as human beings. The physical evidence alone would be enough to expose their crimes, but the testimony of traumatized survivors would provide details that could result in mass executions for murder and cannibalism. The solution proposed by Wilhelm Brenner was characteristically brutal and efficient, reflecting the same ruthless pragmatism that had guided his approach to human butchery throughout the winter months. We eliminate all potential witnesses before the supply train arrives, he suggested with chilling matter-of-factness. Then claim that the missing workers deserted or died from natural causes during the harsh winter months that tested everyone's endurance. Mountain winters are unforgiving, and claim many lives. Brenner continued, his pale eyes reflecting the calculating intelligence that had made him so effective at organizing systematic murder. No one will question a high casualty rate in such dangerous and isolated conditions, especially if the survivors present a unified account of events that emphasizes natural disasters and unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate violence. The plan required the elimination of approximately 30 additional workers in less than 24 hours. A massacre that would dwarf anything they had attempted previously and require coordination and ruthlessness that would test even their hardened commitment to survival through murder. But the alternative exposure trial and certain execution for their crimes made mass murder seem like the only rational choice for men who had already abandoned every moral principle that might have guided their decision-making. Hartwell recognized that the success of Brenner's plan would require the active participation of every member of the inner circle, creating collective guilt that would ensure everyone's silence and commitment to maintaining their fictional account of events. "We're all in this together now," he announced to his assembled followers. "Either we all survive by eliminating the evidence, or we all hang together for what we've done during this winter." The massacre began at dawn on March 5th, just hours before the supply train was scheduled to reach Camp 17, with the inner circle moving through the camp systematically and killing sleeping workers in their bunks with hammers, axes, and whatever weapons they could gather. The victims had no warning and little opportunity to resist, having been weakened by months of malnutrition and psychological trauma that had left them defenseless against their former companions, who had maintained their strength through human flesh. Kazimierz Kowalski's diary provides a horrifying account of those final hours that reads like a descent into hell, orchestrated by men who had completely abandoned their humanity. The screaming started just after sunrise, echoing off the mountain walls like the cries of the damned. I heard Brenner's voice shouting orders, telling his men to clean up efficiently and leave no witnesses who might compromise our story. From my hiding place behind the supply shed, I watched them drag bodies to the cook fires, working with the same methodical precision they had used all winter. But this time, they weren't preparing food. They were destroying evidence of the most systematic campaign of murder I have ever witnessed. The plan was to burn